Text Talks.
Hi, this is Brian Black from Lancaster University, and welcome to another mini lecture in our Text Talk series. And today's lecture is on Mahayana Buddhism. And like the other lectures in this series, you'll see that there are supplementary PowerPoint slides to go along with this lecture. So I start the slideshow with a map, and the map is basically of Asia, just to give you a sense of which countries have the largest presence of Mahayana Buddhism. Now, like other forms of Buddhism that we've learned about, Mahayana Buddhism developed in India. It developed when Buddhism was still a prominent religious tradition in India. But it developed very much as Buddhism was starting to spread into other places in Asia. And so whereas Theravadan Buddhism is largely associated today with countries such as Sri Lanka and Myanmar and Thailand and Laos and Cambodia, in other words, Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, Mahayana Buddhism is more associated with Central and East Asia. And a lot of that has to do with how Buddhism spread at the different times that it spread to these different places. Mahayana Buddhism tended to spread across the old silk routes that basically went through Central Asia into China, Mongolia, and from China into Korea and into Japan. So when you think of Mahayana Buddhism, the countries and cultures that you might think about after it had left India would be China, Korea, and Japan. Okay? So let me just say a few things about its historical context. Now we're on slide 3. Mahayana means great vehicle or the great way. It emerged probably from as early as about 100 BCE all the way up till about 800 CE. Now, I think there's a lot of confusion about Mahayana Buddhism. How do you really describe what it was? And what is the relationship between different traditions described as Mahayana? I think one really helpful way to think about it is that it wasn't a particular school, but rather a larger movement. So in other words, as we've learned before, there are actually a lot of different Buddhist schools that developed in India. Mahayana Buddhism is something that would have affected all of those schools, but in different ways. Another way of thinking about it is that Mahayana Buddhists shared the same Vinaya. Now, what do I mean by that? Mahayana Buddhists shared the same rules for the monastery, the same rules and traditions of monks and nuns. And so, in other words, by the time you have Mahayana Buddhism, it's not like you have different monasteries for Mahayana Buddhists from other Buddhists. Rather, Mahayana Buddhism was something that would have been going on in every monastery. It's just that how it manifested itself in different monasteries would have been different from one monastery to the next. I think one of the another really helpful thing to think about when we think about the development of Mahayana Buddhism is that Mahayana Buddhism developed about the same time that the Buddhist tradition accepted written texts as part of its textual canon. So let's think about this for a moment. Before Mahayana Buddhism, all Buddhist sources were composed and transmitted and remembered orally. Now, if we compare the Buddhist tradition to, say, the Vedic Hindu tradition of in ancient India, when it came to Brahmins learning the Vedas, they would learn the Vedas pretty much as soon as they were learning how to speak. So young Brahmins learning the Vedas would learn the Vedas from the age of, 1.5, 2 years old. And so by the time they were, 10, 12, 14 years old, they could have learned entire Vedas, which was a lot of material. Whereas Buddhists couldn't become Buddhist monks or nuns until after they were about 14 or 15 years old, sometimes older. And in ancient India, usually they required to have the permission of their parents. And so in other words, the Buddhist monks and nuns weren't even starting to memorize the Buddhist texts until they were much older. And I'm sure some of you will already realize that you can memorize things a lot easier when you're younger. And so in that sense, we might say that the Buddhist tradition had already lost out on a number of very important years in terms of being able to memorize the text. So in other words, it was very difficult for the Buddhist tradition early on to incorporate new teachings if any individual Buddhist had a very limited capacity in terms of how much material they could remember. And so if we think of the Mahayana Buddhism as emerging at the same time that the Buddhist tradition accepted the textual tradition as a written tradition, suddenly all sorts of new texts, new ideas could be composed and added to the canon in ways that it just couldn't beforehand. And I think that sort of accounts for this really amazing explosion of new texts and new ideas that basically coincide with the emergence of Mahayana Buddhism. Now I have a slide 4, that basically puts Mahayana Buddhism in a historical context with what was going on with Hinduism at the time. I think it's important to remember that, especially when we're learning about Buddhism, whether we're learning about it in China or India or Japan, was never the only religion in its country at a particular time. And so we have to understand some of the different developments that happen with Buddhism as ones that were not happening in a vacuum, but happening with larger trends that were going on. And I think that this also really helps us understand some of the developments that were going on in Mahayana Buddhism. So, for example, what are some of the characteristics of Mahayana Buddhism? One is a much more of an emphasis on theism. Now, when we were talking about Theravadan Buddhism, we saw that Theravadan Buddhism is not an atheistic religion, as some people might think it is. It wasn't. There are lots of gods that are represented in the early Buddhist sources. But I think one of the things that we do see is that there's not a central god in early Buddhism that's credited with creating and preserving and sort of monitoring the world and intervening. And that basically the Buddha, as the enlightened being, is credited with being more knowledgeable than the gods. However, one of the things that we see with the emergence of with Mahayana Buddhism is that in some cases, not in all, but in some cases, the Buddha is treated more and more like a god. Now, that might seem like it's sort of coming out of the blue if you're only reading the Buddhist sources. But if you're reading the Buddhist sources along with Hindu and other sources that were being composed about the same time in ancient India, we can see that the Hindu tradition was also becoming more theistic at the same time. So in that sense, just knowing that, I think, helps us understand how a tradition that at first seemed quite adamant not to be a theistic tradition could emerge into a theistic tradition several hundred years later. Now, another trend that we see in Mahayana Buddhism is an emphasis on what we might call universalism. This emphasis on the idea that these teachings are for everyone. And sometimes they make a point that the teachings are not just for the monks, but also for the laity, for women, for lower castes. And now this doesn't mean that the earliest teachings were exclusive. It doesn't mean that Theravadan Buddhism was selfish, as it's sometimes accused to be by Mahayana. It doesn't mean that Theravadan Buddhism wasn't also available to the laity, to women, etc. But it does mean that there's a far more emphasis on this in many Mahayana Buddhist sources. And again, this is something we also see in the development of Hinduism. So, for example, any of you who have already studied Hinduism, a good comparison might be between the Upanishads and the Mahabharata, whereas the Upanishads are teachings that are mainly for Brahmins and kind of religious wanderers, etc. A text like the Mahabharata is directing itself towards everybody, and sometimes making a point that its teachings are available for women and children. Women and lower caste people, and sometimes children too. So in that sense, this sort of tendency towards universalism is something that we also see going on at the time. Another is pluralism. What do we mean by that? Basically, that within Mahayana sources, there are often a variety of teachings and practices. Now, sometimes sometimes different teachings might claim to be the truth, as opposed to others that aren't, considered to be as advanced. But the point is that a lot of Mahayana Buddhist texts contain a variety of teachings, and that also if we think of Mahayana Buddhism as a movement, we should remember that not all of the new teachings that were part of this movement were entirely in agreement with each other. But rather this movement as a whole created a sort of space for a multitude of new teachings. Now, another is new texts with different types of authority. And, as we're going to see, there's an explosion of new texts, and I'm going to bring attention to just a few of them to sort of help you get your head around Mahayana Buddhism, as well as give you some places where you can start referring to the texts. Also, we might say that there's an emphasis on ethics, and again, that doesn't mean that earlier, older forms of Buddhism weren't also focusing on ethics. They very much were, but we can say that there's that ethics are talked about in new sorts of ways. And one of the ways that's a huge focus in Mahayana Buddhism is helping others. That the ethical teachings of Mahayana Buddhism are much more sort of directed outwards towards others than merely focusing on cultivating oneself. And another thing that we're not going to be talking about so much here, but it's worth thinking about, is that we see extensive cosmologies. And so in Mahayana texts, you might see reference to many different cosmic ages, many different heavenly worlds, etc. We might say that the Mahayana Buddhist texts have a very sort of expansive imagination of what the cosmos looks like. And it's an imagination that's far more expansive than in earlier sources. Okay, now we're on to slide 5. And so those are general characteristics of Mahayana Buddhism. I want to bring attention to 4 key teachings. One is shunyata, which means emptiness. Another is the teaching of the bodhisattva, which means the Buddha to be. Another is on the teaching of upaya, which is an ethical teaching that is translated sometimes as skill in means or skillful means. And karuna, which means compassion. Now, I want to emphasize these are not the only teachings of Mahayana Buddhism. There are so many different teachings in Mahayana Buddhism. I focus on these 4 because it seems to me, from my sort of experience with the GCSE and A-level specifications, that these are some of the teachings that you're most likely to have to know about. Okay, now that I've kind of broken down some main teachings, now I want to call attention to some of the main sources of Mahayana Buddhism. I mean, literally, there are thousands and thousands of Mahayana Buddhist texts. And in fact, there are more texts, there are more Mahayana Buddhist texts that have remained untranslated than the ones that are even translated into English. So, I mean, literally, you could spend the rest of your life reading Mahayana texts and you'd never finish them. However, what I want to do here is just bring attention to 4 of them as a sort of place to start. And I think what I've tried to do is pick out either some particularly more accessible or more engaging ones. And these are ones that you might look at both for preparing for your exam and hopefully for your own interests when you become so interested in this stuff that you just can't get enough of it. And so you want to be reading Mahayana texts in your free time. So the texts I'm bringing attention to here are one written by the philosopher Nagarjuna that's called the Mula Madhyamika Karika. Another is it's not a text, but a type of text that's called the Prajna Paramita Sutras, or the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And I'm going to bring attention to 2 of these. One's called the Heart Sutra, and one's called the Diamond Sutra. Another text I want to bring attention to is the Lotus Sutra, which is perhaps the most well-read and most referred to Mahayana texts in the Asian world. And then Shantideva's Bodhicharya Avatara, which is basically the handbook on how to become a bodhisattva. Another thing, though, I should bring attention to, that's as I talk about these different sources and referring back to the idea that there are a number of different characteristics of Mahayana Buddhism. And one really interesting and important development in Mahayana Buddhism is that the texts themselves become an object of worship. Oftentimes, the text is worshipped with flags and incense and bells. The practice of reading a text becomes a devotional activity. And oftentimes the texts themselves contain what's called palashrutis. And a palashruti basically refers to a part of the text that talks about the benefits of reading and hearing the text itself. So in other words, some of these texts will tell you that if you read this text or you read this particular passage in the text, that it will bring you benefits, such as a better rebirth or wealth or good luck, these sorts of things. Okay, so now very briefly, I have a slide now on each one of these texts that I've mentioned. The first one is Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamika Karika. And basically what this means is this is the core teachings of the middle way. Nagarjuna is probably the most famous and one of the most influential philosophers in the Buddhist tradition. And one of the ideas that he's particularly associated with is the idea that I've already brought attention to, the idea of shunyata, which means emptiness. And I think one of the best ways to think about Nagarjuna is that on the one hand, he challenged some of the established interpretations of Buddhist teachings at the time, but on the other hand, he backed up all of his most innovative and new arguments with citations from the oldest texts themselves. So in other words, a little bit like Confucius, for example, Nagarjuna did not claim to be an innovator. Nagarjuna did not claim to have new teachings. Rather, Nagarjuna claimed to be a kind of truer and more accurate interpreter of the Buddha's teachings. One of the ways he does that, for example, is to equate shunyata with one of the central teachings of the earliest texts, and that is the teaching of dependent origination. So this quotation I have on the slide from the Mula Madhyamika Karika, he says, we state that whatever is dependent origination, that is emptiness, that is dependent on convention, that is the middle path. So in other words, by equating emptiness with dependent origination, he's not saying this is a new teaching. He's saying this is just perhaps a new way of understanding an old teaching. And if we read Nagarjuna closely, I think we find that he's actually very consistent with some of the teachings of Theravadan Buddhism that you will already be familiar with. Another thing that he's known for is basically making arguments where he neither confirms nor denies things. This is a move that the Buddha makes at times, where, in some of our oldest Theravadan sources, the Buddha says, for example, that he can't say that the self exists, but he can't say that the self doesn't exist. Here in the Mula Madhyamika Karika, we have a similar quotation where it says, empty should not be asserted, non-empty should not be asserted, neither both nor neither should be asserted. They are only used nominally. So I'll let you think about these quotations a little bit more deeply on your own time, but I wanted to give you just sort of a taste of not only what Nagarjuna talks about, but how he expresses himself. Now I want to bring attention to a whole genre of Mahayana literature called the Prajnaparamita Sutras. These are translated as the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. There are at least 40 different texts, and they were composed probably between 100 BCE and 100 CE. And one of the things that's interesting about these texts is they're all called sutras. In other words, all of them mimic the style of the sutras, or in the Theravadan case, the suttas, which are some of our earliest sources of Buddhism. And when I say mimic that style, they all begin with the words, thus I have heard, And they've all began with the same literary conventions that the early suttas do. Usually they talk about the Buddha being in a particular location, and they talk about exactly which students are around the Buddha when he gives a particular teaching. And interesting, they often take place in some of the same places where the Buddha gave sermons or teaching in the earlier sources. But then, beyond these initial conventions that are very similar, then the Mahayana sutras, or in this case the Prajnaparamita sutras, often go in very different directions. One of which is they tend to treat the Buddha as a theistic deity. And then also they contain the types of teachings that we are more likely to see in Mahayana sources than in older ones such as Theravadan sources. Now, one of the most famous Prajnaparamita Sutra is the Heart Sutra. So now I'm on slide number 9, and I'm going to read out a quotation from the Heart Sutra, which I'd say is probably one of the most famous quotations in all of Mahayana Buddhist literature. It says, "Homage to the perfection of wisdom, the lovely, the holy, to Avalokita." Avalokita is the name of a bodhisattva. Homage to Holy Lord Bodhisattva, was moving in the deep course of wisdom which has gone beyond. He looked down from on high. He beheld but 5 heaps, and he saw that in their own being they were empty. Hear, O Sariputra, Sariputra is the audience here, form is emptiness, and the very emptiness is form. Emptiness does not differ from form, nor does it differ from emptiness. Whatever is form, that is emptiness. Whatever is emptiness, that is form. So here we see this quotation about emptiness and form is, a very well-known quotation within Mahayana Buddhism. And emptiness here is a translation of shunyata. And so this idea that on the one hand, we live in a world that's made up of forms, of shapes, but that everything that exists, whether it's a person or, a wardrobe or a table, that these things do not have an inherent nature. And so in that sense, they are empty. But then on the other hand, emptiness itself does not exist in some sort of vacuum that, everything that is empty has some sort of external form. Again, I'll ask you to contemplate the meaning of that further. And, there are a lot of, find other passages that might relate to this one. I think Nagarjuna might be a good place to look for passages that might help explain what this means a little bit further. But this is definitely a quotation that you might think about trying to get to know a little bit better and try to explore a little bit further. Another sutra from the Prajnaparamita Sutras is the Diamond Sutra. This is another one that's very popular through the history of Mahayana Buddhism. The diamond is referring to the Sanskrit word the Vajra, which is also can mean a thunderbolt. And basically, the Vajra cuts through things like wisdom cuts through ignorance. So the Diamond Sutra is meant to be a sutra that helps you sort of cut through ignorance on your way to wisdom. We're not exactly sure how old this sutra is, but we know that it was translated into Chinese probably about 400 in the Common Era. And again, like other Prajnaparamita Sutras, it begins with the conventions of a sutra and takes the form of a dialogue, in this case between the Buddha and Subhuti. Some of the main ideas in this one are non-attachment, not self, emptiness, and the idea of the bodhisattva. Okay, now I want to move on to another sutra, and this is, as I said, one of the most important scriptures in Mahayana Buddhism. It's the main text of a number of different Buddhist schools, such as the Tiantai school in China or the Nichiren school in Japan. It's also very important within the Chan or Zen tradition. It was first translated into Chinese in about 286 in the Common Era. Another thing about the Lotus Sutra is that it's represented in Buddhist art more than any other sutra, and there are more commentaries on the Lotus Sutra than any other Buddhist text. Like the Prajnaparamita sutras, it also begins with the conventions of a sutra, beginning with the words, "Thus I have heard," and it takes the form of dialogue, and it appears in the familiar settings. But then the text takes place in a timeless and internal realm where there are multiple Buddha worlds. And the Buddha is characterized very theistically here as eternal, as omniscient, as omnipotent. Some of the main teachings are about upaya, ways of acting, ways, as an ethical teaching. Also, we learn about teachings about the Buddha nature, this idea that comes throughout the Lotus Sutra, that we all have the capacity to see a Buddha. To be a Buddha. And here we get back to one of the characteristics I was talking about earlier, about Mahayana Buddhism being universalistic. Now, I don't have any long passages to offer here, but I've sort of broken down some of the highlights of the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra has a number of parables, a number of short stories, or sometimes just a few lines that are meant to demonstrate a particular teaching. One of the most famous ones is the one about the burning house, a man who saves his children from a burning house by promising toys if his children's come outside. Of course, there aren't toys, but he says there are, so basically he lies to them, but it's what gets them out of the house to save their lives. And this is a teaching about upaya, about this idea of skill in means, that sometimes the best way to behave towards others is in sort of unusual or unexpected ways. But it's not ethically wrong to do so if you have their best interests in mind, and if that does indeed help them along the Buddhist path. So especially if you're interested in this idea of upaya or skillful means, a number of the parables in the Lotus Sutra are directly about that. And so I think that if you're discussing that teaching, it's good to not only define what skillful, what upaya is, but then to back that up using examples. And these are some great examples to use. Anyway, I have 2 slides listing some of the most famous teachings from the Lotus Sutra. So these are places, once you get a copy of the text or find an online version of the text, these are some of the places where you can go to read about this in more detail. Now, there's just one more text I want to bring attention to, and that is the Bodhicharya Avatara. This is another text for which we know who composed it. It was composed by Shantideva, another well-known Buddhist philosopher who was from Gujarat, educated at Nalanda University. This text was composed probably somewhere between about 685 and 763 CE. So this comes later than the other text that we've been talking about. And this text begins with this famous episode where Shantideva is asked to recite a sutra in front of the university. He was considered to be lazy by his students. They were sort of questioning him, challenging him. What does this guy know? He's just the lazy guy. But then he gets in front of the entire university and recites off the top of his head the Bodhicharya Avatara. And just as he's finishing to recite the text, he rises into the air and disappears. And the remainder of the text was recited by a disembodied voice. So we see this sort of extraordinary, spectacular display of his enlightened state, that he even sort of disappears into another realm as he's reciting it. Now, the main idea explored in this text is the idea of the bodhisattva. We also see, though, he also talks about upaya. He talks about the 6 perfections, which are sort of the path along the way to becoming a bodhisattva. And he talks about karuna, which means compassion. Now, I just want to say a few things about the bodhisattva. Bodhisattva is one of these words that has been in the Buddhist tradition from the very beginning. So even though it changes its meaning and becomes a much more central idea within Mahayana Buddhism, it's a word that we find in our earliest sources. In the earlier Buddhist literature, a bodhisattva is merely one who is in the final stages before attaining enlightenment. So, for example, if you listen to my lecture on Theravada Buddhism, you'll remember that I talked about the Jataka tales. The Jataka tales are stories of the Buddha's previous births. And it's interesting to think that the word that the texts use to describe the Buddha in previous lives, before he became the Buddha, is as a bodhisattva. In other words, he's referred to as somebody who was on his way towards becoming a Buddha. The Mahayana literature, however, transforms the meaning of this word and puts more emphasis on it as describing someone who's not just on their way to becoming a Buddha, but somebody who basically already almost became a Buddha, but basically decided not to enter nirvana, decided to continue to be in this realm of rebirths that constitutes samsara for the sake of helping all other living beings. And so in this way, being a bodhisattva is basically the ultimate act of selflessness. Rather than transcending into ultimate bliss, a bodhisattva is one who basically kind of stays in the mud of samsara, with all the negative things that go along with that, but they do so for the sake of helping others. Now, one of the things you'll find, though, is that bodhisattva not only refers to maybe people living amongst us who we might think of as enlightened beings who are here, who are to help the rest of us along our spiritual journey. But bodhisattva, the term bodhisattva is also used to refer to divine beings who are worshipped like gods or saints. One of the most famous one is this one called Avalokiteshvara, who's very popular in China and Japan. And so, in other words, if you go to a Buddhist temple in East Asia, oftentimes a figure that might kind of look like the Buddha to you or me is actually not the Buddha himself, but is a bodhisattva, another being who has sort of achieved this this enlightened status. Okay, so if you want to find, I'll leave it to you to go to Shantideva's Bodhicharya Avatara to find, more examples of textual descriptions of what it's like to be a bodhisattva. One that I've picked out for you on slide 16 is when Shantideva says, "As long as space abides, and as long as the world abides, so long may I abide, destroying the sufferings of the world. I should dispel the suffering of others because it is suffering like my own suffering. I should help others too because of their nature as beings, which is like my own being." So in other words, here we have the sorts of descriptions we might expect, where the bodhisattva path is described in terms of as staying in samsara for the help of helping others. I also have a slide with some more detailed on upaya. Again, upaya is something we have already encountered in the Lotus Sutra, but Shantideva talks about it as well. And as I said, it can be translated as skillful means, also clever devices. And one of the ways of thinking about upaya is this idea that that different people are in different places along the Buddhist path. So in other words, there's not one Buddhist teaching that's going to be appropriate for everybody in all circumstances. Different people need to hear different things, and different people need to hear different things according to different contexts within their own lives. And so this idea of upaya, we might even see it as a sort of pedagogical ethic, that it's a way of bodhisattvas, it's a sort of recognition that bodhisattvas have the capacity to recognize what their audience needs to hear and giving them the appropriate teaching. It also, though, extends into similar ideas that were being explored in Hinduism at the time, and that is a type of ethics that takes into account the fact that there are times when normally forbidden things can be permitted. So in other words, sometimes one needs to do something surprising, something maybe even shocking, to help somebody else. And I'll leave it to you to look at the Lotus Sutra and to look at Shantideva for what kind of examples. But again, it's the idea that that people need different things, and that sometimes what they need might be very surprising. But also another thing I think is inherent within the idea of upaya is that you have to be a bodhisattva to decide that. So even if sometimes extreme acts are sometimes permitted for the sake of helping somebody else along the Buddhist path, it's only a bodhisattva who is sort of given the license to be able to act in those extreme ways. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there, and I do have one more slide where I've listed the 6 perfections of a bodhisattva, and of course I have a final slide that lists some primary and secondary sources, and I've tried where possible to list ones that are available online. Okay, thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking with you again during our next text talks.